Can women serve in ministry? Can they hold leadership positions? Or does the Bible subjugate them to a lesser role? Stick around for a few minutes, find out the answers to these important questions. Okay, so in 1 Corinthians 14:34, Paul makes this statement that men have used for centuries to restrict women from being in ministry. Okay, Paul says this: women should be silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be subordinate, as the law also says. Now, what does this mean? Well, before I answer that question, do me a favor, take a second to like, subscribe, and follow this channel. This is a topic we really need to get out to a lot of people, so help me out by hitting all of those buttons. Okay, on face value, it does sound like women are being restricted in this verse and that they cannot even speak in church. But what we need to do when we come across difficult passages like this is we need to look at the cultural and the historical context. We need to look to see, is there a historical reason why Paul would say this? Is there a cultural reason Paul would say this? And so when we're reading this, we really need to look into those two pieces, because we need to understand what was Paul trying to convey to his audience at that time. So first, we need to recognize that the cultural norm of the first century in that region of the world frowned upon women speaking in public in mixed gender environments or mixed gender settings. So when men and women were together, it was frowned upon for women to engage in public discourse. Okay, that was normal in that culture at that time. We see this in some non-biblical writings. You can look at the writings of Plutarch, you can look at the writings of Maximus. Both of them were popular writers in that era, and they both speak to this topic in their writings, generally that women shouldn't be speaking in mixed genders. So that was common culturally. So there's a cultural thing right there off the top. We also know that women were not as well educated as men during this era. Not because they weren't smart enough, not because they weren't capable enough, but simply because it wasn't common in that culture. And this would have especially been true for Israelite women who were studying biblical topics. You wouldn't have seen that very often. Women would not have had a great understanding of biblical topics. So think about this. If women were in a mixed gender setting, a church setting, a synagogue setting, and they were asking questions about biblical topics, it's likely that most of the men in the room would have already understood those questions, and so it would become a distraction for everyone else because they didn't understand it, but everyone else did. And I could see that could be a distraction, and Paul could be saying, hey, you know what? This is not something we need to deal with here. Why don't you be silent for now? Ask your husband that question when you get home so that we can move this teaching along. Okay? So I heard somebody give this analogy once that I thought was really good. If you took a 4th grade student and you put them into a 7th grade math class, they're going to have a lot of questions because there's a lot they're not going to understand, right? They're going to be asking, well, I don't understand this algebra thing. I don't understand what you mean by x equals 3. They're going to have all these questions that all the other 7th graders might already understand. And it's going to become a distraction, and the teacher will end up using all of their time to teach this one student from 4th grade the baseline understanding they need instead of teaching the 7th graders what they need to know. So a wise teacher would pull aside a 7th grader and say, hey, take her aside, teach her this stuff so that when we're in class next time, she'll be all caught up and ready to go, right? That makes sense, and I think that's kind of what we're seeing in this passage. One of the ways we can interpret Scripture is to look at other Scripture. We can interpret the Bible with the Bible. And because Paul wrote a lot of content, it's really easy to look at the totality of what Paul wrote to see, is he really restricting women in ministry? And what we find is that Paul consistently promoted the ministry of women, promoted the work they were doing, spoke highly of them. Here's a few examples. Phoebe is listed as a deaconess. Junia is listed as an apostle. Euodia and Syntyche were both listed as evangelists spreading the gospel, likely alongside Paul. And Paul, he even gave specific instructions for female deacons in 1 Timothy 3:11. So he wouldn't have given specific instructions for female deacons if he didn't want women to be deacons, right? He wouldn't have given specific instruction for women in leadership if he didn't want women in leadership. He wouldn't have listed people as apostles and as deacons, women as apostles and deacons, if that's not what he wanted, if he was trying to restrict them. So we have to go back and look at this passage in 1 Corinthians in light of all of that. And what we can understand is Paul was not restricting women in ministry. He was simply saying, in this environment, in this point, in this moment, ask your questions of your husbands at home because you're being a distraction. That's most likely the best interpretation of this passage, okay? So thus saith the Lord, Paul did not restrict women in ministry, okay? I think really what he was doing was actually a bit countercultural by encouraging men to teach their wives the scriptures at home, right? By the way, it was also very common in that era for people to interrupt speakers when they were speaking. It wasn't uncommon at all to interrupt and inject and interact a bit. So Paul wasn't challenging the issue of being interrupted. I think he was just challenging the issue of being interrupted by people who weren't educated on the topic. And he needed to move the topic of the gospel forward and couldn't spend time with all the underlying issues that the women of that day probably didn't understand. Okay, now I go a little bit deeper in my article, so check the link below, follow that, read the article. I give some good exegesis of some of the verses. I give you some passages where these women are mentioned by Paul, and I also give some sources for the early church culture. So check that out. And let me know what you think in the comments. Leave your comments. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let me know why. And I'll see you next time.